What does it actually take to spark a genuine spiritual fire? Well, today we're diving into a text that pulls absolutely no punches on that very question. We're going to break down a really fiery and provocative chapter from Why Revival Tarries, which is a classic work by the 20th century evangelist Leonard Ravenhill.
Right away, you can see Ravenhill does not ease you into his subject. He just opens with this absolute crisis declaration. This isn't a suggestion, it's more like an emergency broadcast. And this quote, right from the get-go, sets this desperate, urgent tone for the entire argument that's about to follow.
So the first part of his argument really explores why he sees revival not just as something to be, hoped for, but as a desperate, immediate, right now kind of need.
And he immediately points out what he sees as this fundamental contradiction. On one hand, you have this deep-seated cry for a spiritual awakening. But on the other hand, there's this desire for it to be, convenient, easy, painless. And that's a path, he argues, just flat out does not exist.
This brings us to what Ravenhill identifies as the great mistake. What he considers the modern, kind of shallow approach to something that's supposed to be a really profound spiritual matter. He even coins this fantastic term for it, the slot machine method. He uses it to criticize any attempt to get this glorious, divine power without paying the necessary spiritual price. It's the idea that you can just, put in some minimal effort, like a coin, and expect a guaranteed jackpot-like result from heaven.
And here, you can really see the stark contrast he's drawing. On one side, you've got this slick, mechanized, convenient approach. And on the other, he points to the Hebrides revival, a real historical example that he says was born from the exact opposite. Immense, tear-stained, sacrificial effort.
And wow, he really does not mince words. He uses this incredibly sharp analogy to argue that, in his view, a lot of modern religious environments have become so cold and sterile that they're basically incapable of producing or even sustaining genuine spiritual life.
Okay, so if the modern way is wrong, what does Ravenhill say is the right way? Well, this leads us to the central metaphor of his entire argument. At its core, Ravenhill's whole point is this: genuine spiritual awakening follows the same laws as natural birth. It requires a long, difficult, and often painful process. He's insisting there are just no shortcuts, and you can't mechanize or eliminate this organic process. He even breaks this analogy down into a really clear three-step process. It starts with the burden, this deep sense of need. Then it moves into a period of intense, agonizing spiritual effort he calls travail. And only after all that pain does new spiritual life emerge.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the heart of his message. It's captured in this powerful, desperate cry from the Bible that's also the chapter's title. This isn't just some casual wish. This is a cry of life or death desperation.
Now, Ravenhill doesn't just leave this as a metaphor. He actually grounds his argument in historical and biblical examples to prove that this desperate struggle is a necessary part of the whole process. He anchors his entire argument in the story of the biblical figure Rachel. Now, she was loved, she was beautiful, but she was barren. And her barrenness drove her to this point of absolute desperation where she cried out for a child as if her very life depended on it.
And he just keeps expanding on this pattern, pointing to all these other key figures from Scripture. His argument is that history's greatest spiritual breakthroughs were consistently born from situations of profound desperation and struggle, not from comfort and ease.
Then, just to show this isn't only an ancient idea, he points to how this same desperate spirit echoes through history. With the famous prayer of the 16th century reformer John Knox, he felt a similar life-or-death burden for the spiritual state of his whole nation.
So all of this leads to the author's final and really uncompromising verdict on why he believes revival tarries, or is delayed, in our modern era.
He poses this direct question, not just to the reader, but really to the entire religious establishment he's talking to. After laying out his whole case, he basically forces a confrontation with the source of the problem.
And his answer is, well, it's unequivocal. The responsibility, he claims, lies not with a reluctant God, but with a church that has become powerless because it's unwilling to pay the spiritual price that revival demands.
And this really brings us to Ravenhill's bottom line. The path to revival is a fixed, unchanging spiritual law. You can't bypass it with modern methods or clever programs. The price, he insists, has always been and will always be agonizing and desperate travail.
And so Ravenhill ends with this provocative charge. It's a question that really just leaves the reader to ponder the depths of their own desire for change. It's a stark, challenging perspective on what it truly costs to see transformation.